All right, today I am pleased to introduce Hannah Besso, who will be defending her PhD dissertation. Before I introduce her, I'll let you know the format of the exam. Basically, Hannah will talk for roughly 45 minutes about what she's done. We will then open the floor for questions from the general audience. You can ask her your hard-hitting questions until we cut you off. There's so many of you may have more questions. You have time to answer, so raise your hand quickly. We'll then dismiss everybody except the committee. And we will then question Hannah for another hour. And then we will let her out to go see the rest of her friends and family. So I found that Hannah, I first met via email on December 4th, 2019, when she wrote to me and she said, "Hi, I hope you're having a wonderful fall semester." She actually knew way more about me than I knew about her at the time. She had already been working with my group in Yosemite National Park doing stream flow monitoring for 3 years. She'd been working with another group at Mount Rainier doing wildflower monitoring. And she'd also been working for NASA Develop doing satellite remote sensing. And so she took all those skills she had before she came here. And you'll see how she put them together in her presentation. She was also at the time ski patrol for Crystal Mountain Resort. Now remember, she's writing to me in December 4th, 2019, meant she got recruited to start in fall of 2020, which was a really exciting time to be doing anything. And I wrote to Hannah and I'm like, "Dear Hannah, please don't move to Seattle. Stay at Crystal Mountain Ski Resort and keep skiing because being here is not going to be worth it." And I think that helped her being one of the most sane people during that year because she could get outside a lot more than many of us. During the time she's been here, she also committed to taking a bunch of extra math and fluid mechanics before she came. And when she came, she had a Future Rivers Fellowship that supported some travel to do some outreach about rivers in the region. She is featured you may see her on the UW recruitment video. They were doing grad students from the bottom of the sea to the top of the sky. I think you were the top of the sky, or you were the top where people live. The people in outer space were higher, but she was the highest filmed person. They didn't have anyone in a spaceship. She could have, in case this just doesn't go well, she could be very good at backup careers in travel blogs. If you've ever heard Hannah describe her travels, she always makes me want to go wherever Hannah went. She gave a talk about, she got a VALA fellowship to go to Norway for a year. I think she recruited half people in our department to also want to go to Norway. She also said the Dolomites are good. I'm sure, anyway, she could be an influencer and a travel blog person if she wants. Also, if that doesn't work out, she's really good at knitting. She can teach you that. Now, I'm not really skeptical of not working out because she won the best student presentation at the Western Snow Conference a couple years ago. In addition to the VALA Fellowship, she's also won a NASA Finest Fellowship to support her work. With that, I will turn it over to Hannah to show the actual science she's done. And thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. It's great to see so many faces in person and on Zoom. Today, I'm presenting my dissertation work titled From Stations to Satellites, Pattern-Based Estimation of Mountain Snow Water Equivalent. I want to acknowledge my committee members, Jessica Lundquist, Bart Neeson, David Sheen, and GSR Lynn McMurdy. And I want to point out this term snow water equivalent, referred to as SWE. This is the amount of water that's stored in the snowpack. In the spring, the snow melts and feeds our rivers and streams, and water managers need to know how much snow will melt and when that water will end up in our streams so that they can manage our water resources efficiently. In the Western US, snowmelt contributes over 50% of runoff, and the timing of that runoff is controlled by the spatial distribution of mountain SWE. So my dissertation has focused on mapping spatial distribution of SWE. Before we get into details on my chapters, we're going to go over some background information on products that we'll be using. Global SWE products vary by a factor of 5. Even in the well-studied Western US, there are large uncertainties, which we can see in this figure. On the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have SWE volume. And just the spread of products here is really large. Some products you can see are better than others compared to this black line, which is considered the truth. We're going to focus on some of the best products in this region that are produced in a couple different ways. So there's 3 ways we're going to talk about how we can model SWE. The first is to run a model with just meteorological data as the input. This is used for AR5 land. I'm not going to go into details about this product, but I did want to point out that it's forced with AR5 meteorology, so temperature, precipitation, things like that, which is globally available. So we're not going to talk about that until chapter 3, so I'm going to kind of get rid of it for now. And I'm actually going to introduce an observational product that's going to help us evaluate the other modeled products that I want to introduce. So airborne LiDAR is considered the gold standard of SWE observations. It's collected using an airplane that's equipped with a LiDAR instrument that flies over a basin during the summer and also during the winter. And the highly accurate elevation data is used then to calculate high resolution SWE. This is an operational product, but it's limited in how large of an area it can fly and by cost. So in SWE studies, it's often treated as the truth or as close to it as we can get. And we're going to look at a study that compared these other modeled SWE products to 26 different LiDAR flights to get a sense of how accurate they are. So this is a figure adapted from Lundquist et al. 2026. This is one of the scenes that they looked at, and we're going to use it as a example. It's a typical scene. So this is from a headwater basin in Colorado. You can see SWE is on the color bar. Magenta is deeper SWE. And now I'm going to explain some of these products. So one way that we can model SWE is by running a model that then assimilates in situ observations from stations, such as those in the SNOTEL network, which are available throughout the Western US, but are rare globally. The map on the right shows where there are stations, and it might look like there's a lot of stations, but remember that these are just point locations, and there's a lot of work needed to be done to fill in the missing information between these stations. So the picture shows an example of one of these stations. So SNODAS is an operational product that assimilates these in situ and other observations. It has relatively small overall bias. It is used operationally because it's produced in near real time. It's one of the best products available in near real time for the Western US. This map shows the spatial distribution here on the bottom, shows the spatial distribution of SWE in the basin using the same color bar as for the LiDAR scene next to it. We can already see some differences between these scenes, the resolution, maybe the magnitude, and some spatial distribution, but it can be hard to compare these maps. So we can rearrange or organize these maps by elevation. So on this figure, there's a lot of products. We're only going to focus on a few of them. On the x-axis is SWE, on the y-axis is elevation. And I want you to focus on the black line, which shows our truth, the airborne LiDAR. And the other products are modeled products. And we can see that there's a large spread of products, but we're focused on the blue line, which shows SNODAS. And ideally, our modeled products would line up or match that black line that's truth perfectly. But we can see that SNODAS underestimates SWE at high elevations. So maybe it's unbiased overall, but maybe it doesn't get the spatial distribution quite right. Another way that we can model SWE is by running an ensemble of forward run models that assimilate satellite data after the end of the snow season that retroactively can map SWE. Satellite data that's commonly assimilated is fractional snow-covered area. And the product I want to highlight here is the UCLA Western US SWE reanalysis product, which is a mouthful, so we're just going to call it WUSR. So WUSR uses this framework, which can be produced only once all snow has melted. So we don't get this data in real time. But it benefits from the spatial information that's assimilated from the satellite data. So it actually maps SWE distribution the most accurately of all of these products. And the framework that it uses can be applied in data sparse regions because it's using satellite data, not in situ data. So this framework has been applied in other regions globally, such as the Andes or high mountain Asia. Here we see the spatial distribution of the SWE in this watershed. And then we can look at our plot by elevation to see the red dashed line highlighted by this arrow. And we can see that this product aligns the closest with the black line. So it looks like it gets the spatial distribution of SWE, the best of any of the products plotted here. We just covered a lot of information. So in summary, SNODAS is the best operational product in the Western US, one of the best, but it lacks some spatial accuracy and it relies on in situ stations, so it can't be produced in global regions where there's not as much data available. Worcester is the most accurate spatial distribution product, is available in regions that have reliable reanalysis or reliable fractional snow covered area observations, but it can only provide historical information, so it can't be used in real time by water managers. And remember that the spatial distribution of SWE is really important for the timing of snowmelt runoff. So we want to see if there's maybe a way that we can use the really accurate spatial information from historical maps to help inform current estimates. One way that maybe we can do this is through the existence of snow patterns. So snow patterns are known to repeat from year to year. These two photos are of Mount of the Holy Cross in Colorado. On the left is a photo from 1873. On the right is a photo from 2004. And we can see that the areas where snow remains late in the season are spatially consistent. In this case, snow is remaining in the deep crevices shaped like a cross on the mountain face. These patterns form because of consistent storm pathways that come off the Pacific. Oh, of course. Oh, no. Thank you. These patterns form because of consistent storms that come off the Pacific and interact with the topography along the west coast of the US. So we're going to look at an example of a storm. This is an atmospheric river coming off the Pacific, hitting the coast of California, and it interacts with mountains in consistent ways. So the mountains can block, deflect, or extract precipitation from these storms. And on the right, you can see pathways that moisture can get through gaps in the mountains, the coastal mountains, to access or provide moisture to the Intermountain West. These are really fun, so let's look at another storm track. They're so beautiful. Wow, this is a bomb cyclone apparently that is impacting the whole west coast of the US. So snow patterns are the most reliable near the timing of peak SWE, which is approximated by April 1st. And sampling snow quantity and variability once near peak SWE is enough to correct the majority of snow model errors for the remainder of the season. So accurate historical SWE records could allow us to identify these repeating spatial patterns. There it is again. So that's the question that my dissertation asks. The overarching question is, how can we use historical spatial patterns to improve real-time estimates of distributed SWE compared to operational products? We'll address this question through my 3 chapters. Chapter 1 uses historical statistics and in situ stations. Chapter 2 evaluates satellite data as a substitute for in situ observations for areas where we don't have in situ. And chapter 3 combines techniques from chapters 1 and 2 in the everything but the kitchen sink approach, where we'll use statistical techniques, additional statistical techniques to refine pattern identification, globally available products such as Aero5 meteorology and satellite data to test methods that could be used in global mountain regions. We're going to talk about a lot of techniques and data products, so I'm going to introduce this conceptual guide to keep us organized. Okay, and we're going to start with chapter 1. In this chapter, we'll use a leave one out framework with historical data from Worcester and current data from in situ stations. This work is published in Water Resources Research, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. If you're interested, feel free to read the paper. Super exciting, I know. I'm going to go through the topics that you'll need for chapter 3. So we know from this map from the NRCS that shows the percent of long-term median at in situ stations that locations where SWE is above or below normal have a lot of spatial correlation. This is a map from earlier this week. So in this case, most of the West is experiencing a below normal year. We're going to look at a region of Colorado. So throughout Colorado, we can see that there's below normal SWE. Those are the yellow, orange, and red values here. And these two stations, Schofield Pass Station and Butte Station, are both yellow, indicating that they have similar percents from normal. We're going to see if we can calculate SWE using these two stations and this historical pattern idea. So on the x-axis here, we have 30 years of April 1st SWE at the Butte Station. On the y-axis, we have the 30 years of April 1st SWE at the Schofield Pass Station. The gray line is the one-to-one line. And we can see that these two stations have very different SWE amounts on April 1st across years. So Schofield Pass consistently has more SWE than the Butte Station does. But that map we looked at before didn't look at SWE values, it looked at percentiles. So instead of looking at SWE, maybe we can normalize by converting SWE into standardized anomalies. So here I is location, T is time. We're going to subtract the long-term mean from the current year SWE value and divide by the long-term standard deviation. Now on the right plot, we have standard anomalies, or SAs, at the Butte Station on the x-axis and Schofield Pass on the y-axis. And you can see that the SA values are very similar across this 30-year timescale. Now, if we rearrange the equation that we use to calculate standard anomalies, we see that it can be used to transform those values back to SWE using the historical mean and standard deviation. This is at the top of the screen now. Since the SAs were similar at the two stations, we should be able to use the SA from one station to predict SWE at the other station. And in this case, we're going to predict SWE at the Butte Station using the standard anomaly from Schofield Pass Station. Now on the left is the result, and you can see there's a high correlation and low bias around that one-to-one line. So the SWE measured at Butte is on the x-axis, and SWE predicted using this standard anomaly technique is on the y-axis. We did this at these two in-situ stations, but we have historical records from the entire Western US from this Worcester product. We can use that to calculate the historical mean and standard deviation at every grid cell in the Western US. And then we can use this historical information in our equation to calculate SWE. So here you see we're adding in the stations throughout the Western US. We'd be using standard anomalies at these stations. You could do this everywhere, but we're going to evaluate this method for the Upper Colorado River Basin, or the UCRB. On the left, you can see, or the right, you can see an outline of the UCRB plotted with the Worcester SWE data and the location of in-situ stations. And on the left, you can see that we'll be predicting SWE at a Worcester grid cell, all of the grid cells, based on a nearby in-situ station or multiple stations. Here we have SWE calculated using this method for 2020. We can compare it to the Worcester data in that year, since we're using a leave one out framework. And we can evaluate the distribution of the spatial errors. We can compare these spatial errors to the differences between SNODAS and the Worcester product in this same year. And in general, we think maybe we're seeing higher magnitude errors, although it's hard to see on this screen, higher magnitude errors for SNODAS than for our standard anomaly product. But it's hard to evaluate on this map. And this is just 1 year. So we can look at metrics from all of the years, all 30 years. So this is box plots showing the coefficient of determination for each of these products. The purple is standard anomaly and the blue is SNODAS. So we can see that the standard anomaly calculated SWE has stronger correlation with Worcester, has lower root mean squared error, and has similar bias, although there's a slightly larger spread of percent bias. And remember that SNODAS has generally small basin-wide bias, but the spatial distribution is what we're trying to improve, which is captured by the other metrics, the R squared and the root mean squared error. So in chapter 1, we found that standard anomalies are more spatially coherent than SWE values. Standard anomaly calculated SWE outperformed SNODAS relative to Worcester. This is a computationally simple method that is applicable where you have a reliable reanalysis and long-term in-situ stations. Oh, and we hypothesize that this method will perform best in cold regions where you are mostly capturing patterns in accumulation, not melt. So we might not work as well where we have midwinter melt or rain on snow events. Now in chapter 2, we're going to address the dependence on in-situ stations by evaluating observations from ICESat-2 satellite, which provides potentially global coverage. And that leads us into chapter 2. So remember our conceptual guide that I introduced earlier. We're going to take a quick break from statistics. I'm sure everyone's breathing a sigh of relief. And we're just going to focus on data. So we'll again use WSR, and I'm going to introduce the ICESat-2 satellite. So the ICESat-2 satellite altimeter has a near polar orbit and measures surface elevations with a 6-beam photon counting LiDAR system. It has centimeter scale vertical accuracy over polar ice sheets. The data is available in water years 2019 to the present, where a water year is October 1st of the previous year to September 30th of the current year. And previous studies have shown that the ICESat-2 elevation data can be used to calculate snow depth by calculating the elevation difference between snow on ICESat-2 measurements and snow off airborne LiDAR measurements. To use this method, we do need the high accuracy snow off terrain models from airborne LiDAR to provide those snow off elevations. For my master's thesis, which maybe some of you attended my defense, we aggregated ICESat-2 snow depth estimates in a headwater basin of the Sierra Nevada. And this is published and you can read it if you would like. In this paper, we custom processed the data using slide rule Earth for more accurate snow depth estimates in mid-latitude mountains. And since this work was completed, the USGS has provided a homogenized elevation product from airborne LiDAR throughout the US. And slide rule has implemented sampling of this data at ICESat-2 measurement locations. So given these advancements, we can now easily scale up to the mountain range scale. And that's what we're going to do. So here we custom processed ICESat-2 data using slide rule for the entire Sierra Nevada. We sampled the USGS 3-depth snow-off elevations through slide rule and excluded measurements on slopes that exceeded 20 degrees. We aggregated snow depth by acquisition date and finding the median snow depth for each date. So here's an example acquisition for ICESat-2 data. This is not aggregated. This is for April 1st of 2021. And you can see that there are still some negative snow depths, which seems odd. This is why aggregating the data is really important because there's a large spread to the individual measurements here. So this is one date, but we can look at all of the dates that ICESat-2 collected data during the snow on period in the Sierra Nevada. So these are all the available acquisitions. And we can compare the ICESat-2 snow depth to snow depth from the WSR product, since WSR also outputs snow depth in addition to SWE. This scatter plot shows the median snow depth from each ICESat-2 acquisition date. That's on the x-axis, compared to the median for each date of co-located WSR snow depth. So those are grid cells that are located at the same location as ICESat-2 data points. The data have high correlation and small bias for this comparison of co-located data, but we can also compare the median ICESat-2 values to the median snow depth throughout the entire Sierra Nevada from the WSR product. So this is showing a time series plot across the 3 years, 2019 to 2021. The continuous black line here that's plotting snow depth is the median snow depth for the entire Sierra Nevada from the WSR product. Now I'm adding on the ICESat-2 data from each acquisition date. Here, the dark green horizontal lines are the median ICESat-2 value for each date, and the light green boxes is the interquartile range for the measurements on that date. you can see that the median ISAT2 values capture the temporal evolution of snow depth throughout these years. But some acquisitions match the domain median better than others. So we have two orange boxes here that I'm going to highlight. The first shows snow depth from March 16th, 2019. And on this date, the ISAT2 acquisition was in an area of the Sierra Nevada that has much lower snow depth than the rest of the mountain range. And that is reflected in the median value being lower than the black line. Conversely, on April 1st of 2021, the ISAT2 median matched the domain median very closely. And this acquisition occurred in an area of the Sierra Nevada that has snow depth that better represents the median value for the whole range. So this highlights one issue that by aggregating all the data, we're not capturing spatial variability in snow depth. In conclusion, in chapter 2, we showed that aggregated ISAT2 snow depth can accurately represent domain median snow depth throughout the entire Sierra Nevada. The data capture the temporal evolution of snow depth in the domain across those 3 years. But we don't capture spatial variability with this approach. But this data could be used in global regions that have snow-off airborne LiDAR data. One caveat is that we still need some shorter data latency from NASA for this data to be used in near real time. So potentially they could prioritize the processing of ISAT2 at data centers to produce this product instead of the current 3-month latency, maybe a 1 to 2 week latency. I wanted to highlight some remaining issues after our first 2 chapters. So in chapter 1, we relied on in situ stations for the SWE calculations that used the SA method. And we hypothesized that it would work best in cold regions where you don't have midwinter rain or melt. And in chapter 2, we evaluated a potentially global source of snow depth information, but we don't get spatial distribution from this. So in chapter 3, we're going to solve all of our problems. We're going to add some statistical refinement to try to capture more complex spatial patterns. We'll use globally available meteorology and satellite data instead of in situ stations to try to test methods that could potentially be globally applicable. Leads us into chapter 3. Back to our conceptual guide. This is the everything but the kitchen sink method. So we're going to add some more statistical techniques to refine our representation of complex snow patterns. We'll get into that later. Let's start with something a little more familiar. We're going to use standard anomalies to calculate SWE. This time, instead of in situ stations, we're using ERA5 and ISAT2. And we're making the assumption that ISAT2 becomes available in near real time. So we used cumulative water year snowfall from ERA5. And ERA5 is a global reanalysis product that assimilates observations of meteorological variables. It has a horizontal resolution of 31 kilometers, a 5-day latency, and it's available from 1940 to the present day. In chapter 2, as you'll remember, we looked at ISAT2 in the Sierra Nevada. And now remember that it was only available starting in 2019, the water year. So now we're going to simulate ISAT2 data to extend the data record for the whole period that we have the WSR data. We sampled WSR data at the location of common ISAT2 point locations and added in characteristic errors that we found from chapter 2. Then we calculated SWE at each WSR grid cell according to our equation that we've seen before, using standard anomalies from ERA5 and ISAT2. Before I show results from different years, I want to build some intuition around the years that we're going to be looking at. So here I'm showing 3 years. Here I'm showing, 3 years of SWE data. We have time on the x-axis and SWE on the y-axis. And you can see the green line is the median value for the Sierra Nevada. The blue line is 2015, which was a record low year, kind of maybe similar to this year. 2009 was approximately normal, and 2019 was a high snow year. And to highlight this, These are photos from the California DWR that were taken during their snow surveys. So on the left, you see April 2015, there was no snow at all at the snow course, which is very unusual. And then on the right, in 2019, there was snow, and it looks like there was plenty of snow. And we need the best help to predict stream flow in these weird years when patterns don't look quite like what we expect. So we want to do better at predicting SWE than just capturing average years. We want to capture these kind of anomalous years. We're going to look at the results from our essay SWE calculations in our big year, 2019. So here is SWE from Whistler in that year. Here's the differences between SNODAS and Whistler. And recall that SNODAS generally has small overall bias, but the spatial errors appear to be large, such that certain basins will be over or underestimated. Those are the dark blue and dark red lines indicating over and underestimation. And then here are the errors from the standard anomaly methods that used ERA5 and ISAT2. We can see that in general, they have lower magnitude spatial errors than SNODAS, but there are still errors. And recall that in chapter 1, we thought the essay method should perform best when there's no midwinter rain or melt. This is because melt patterns are distinct from accumulation patterns. And if precipitation is falling as rain in part of the region and as snow in the other part of the region, the spatial patterns will diverge. The Sierra Nevada are warmer than the UCRB in Colorado, where we tested this method last. So this might cause some problems, but we can see that the spatial errors potentially have some spatial structure themselves. So we wonder if we can maybe capture some of these additional patterns. To do that, I'm going to introduce another statistical method. We'll be running an EOF, empirical orthogonal function analysis, on the standard anomalies in the Sierra Nevada to identify additional patterns that are not explained by just the standard anomalies. This is a statistical method that decomposes complex spatial and temporal data into independent patterns of variability. To start, we're going to calculate standard anomalies again at each Whistler grid cell in each year. And this gives us information in space and time, which we can organize into a matrix that has space and time information. Then we can run a singular value decomposition on this data to extract patterns. This technique is widely used in atmospheric science, signal processing, and dimensionality reduction, similar in concept to image compression methods like JPEG. This results in spatial patterns, which are referred to as EOFs. The amount of variance explained from the input data by each spatial pattern, and the temporal weights for each pattern. And these are called principal components, or PCs. Let's look at these spatial and temporal patterns that result. So a spatial map shows where this pattern is stronger or weaker across the region. This first spatial pattern explains 24% of the variance that remains after we calculate the standard anomalies. And we can interpret these patterns to help us explain variations in standard anomalies. So we hypothesize that this first pattern is driven by large-scale weather patterns that affect the entire range in similar ways, because we can see that the whole range has the same sign in a given year. And here we have the principal components, PCs, which show the strength of the associated spatial pattern in each year. Here's the second EOF with weights that vary potentially by elevation. And to convince you of this, I've plotted elevation on the x-axis and the EOF2 weights on the y-axis. We can see a pretty strong R value. There might be some latitude signal in here as well, but the variance explained by this pattern is 7.5%. And we think this is likely driven by the elevation of the freezing line, where rain falls instead of snow, which would be driven by temperature and precipitation. And here are the associated PCs. And then we see the third EOF, which explains 5% of the remaining variance. And you can see that it varies by latitude. So we think it's likely driven by storm tracks that are impacting the north or the south of the region more often in a certain year. So imagine atmospheric rivers hitting the south more often than the north or vice versa. And then here are the associated PCs with this spatial pattern. So here on the y-axis is the amount of variance explained by each pattern. You can see that the variance explained decreases with EOF, the larger the EOF number. And the amount of variance explained really tapers off after the third pattern. So we're going to think of the further patterns as noise, and we'll just use the first three patterns in our analysis. And these EOF patterns are useful because they can help us interpret these remaining patterns of variability, and we can use those patterns to reconstruct a simplified version of the input data. And we can transform ones back from standard anomalies to SWE using historical information, as we've seen before. So we calculated SWE using this method, and using the EOF method to refine those patterns that remain after calculating standard anomalies. This is calculated using the known PC weights. But what we really want to do is calculate SWE in a year where we don't know the PC weights, where we didn't have information that could be input into the EOF analysis. So recall that the spatial patterns and explained variance are static in time, while the PCs are the component that changes from year to year. We want to then be able to estimate PC values for years that were not included in the EOF analysis. And to test this, we'll use a leave one out framework on the historical record to estimate PCs in a year withheld from the EOF analysis. And then we'll calculate SWE in that year and compare it to the Wisser product in that year. We'll do this by building regressions for each PC using data from the current year, since we want to be able to estimate this in the current year. We'll use ERA 5 meteorology and ISAT-2 observations to build these regressions. And to predict PC weights, we want to use variables that we think drive these EOF patterns. So recall that EOF1 we think is driven by large-scale weather patterns. EOF2 we think is driven by elevational gradients in maybe temperature and precipitation that impacts snowline. And for EOF3 we think it's maybe storm tracks that are more often hitting the north or south of the mountain range. So to predict PC weights, we're using variables from ERA 5 meteorology. Those are cumulative precipitation, cumulative snowfall, and average temperature. And we're also using snow depth from ISAT-2 and calculating variables that are aggregated for the entire domain, aggregated just for the north or the south of the region, and then also within elevation bands. You can ask me more details later if you want. So still within a leave one out framework, we built multilinear regressions on these variables from each data set separately for ERA 5, for ISAT-2, and then for all of the variables together. And this way we can compare the resultant SWE maps that used data from the different sources to compare how important predictors from each data set were. We just covered a lot of information. So far in this approach, we calculated standard anomalies from the current and historical data. We ran an EOF analysis on historical standard anomalies. We regressed temporal PCs against current year data. And now we're going to use spatial EOFs and predicted PCs to construct current year standard anomalies at all grid cells. So back to our equation here. For this example, we're going to calculate standard anomalies in 2019 using EOF reconstruction. So this is a leave one out framework. So 2019 was left out of the EOF and regression analysis. Notice that I have added these pink dots in the PC time series. So these are the values that we estimated using our regressions. Okay, and then we're going to calculate SWE using these standard anomalies that we reconstructed from the EOF method. So we see the same equation again. We transform to SWE. And here is the results in 2019. We're filling in our spatial data here. It looks like we have maybe some mixed results, but in general, the EOF products seem to be closer overall to the EOF reconstruction that used the known PCs. Rather than closer to the standard anomalies. But it's a little hard to compare these maps. So we're going to organize these by elevation and latitude. Here we have elevation bins on the x-axis, latitude on the y-axis. So it's kind of this blobby shape that doesn't quite look like the outline of the Sierras, but it's organized by elevation bin and latitude bin. This is Snowdass compared to Whistler for 2019, and you can see Snowdass strongly overestimated low to mid elevation SWE and underestimated high elevation SWE. So there's some spatial errors. And then we can add on the two SWE products that resulted from the standard anomaly method. They overestimated higher elevation SWE, underestimated SWE at northern low elevations. And using standard anomalies from ERA 5 led to more overestimation and vice versa. Here's the results from the EOF analysis that used the true principal components. And overall, we see it has small spatial errors, but note that it still does have some spatial errors. It's not a perfect product, and that's because we're only using the first 3 EOF patterns and ignoring the other patterns, which we thought of as noise. So it's not a perfect reconstruction. But this is kind of the benchmark, the best that we can expect from our other EOF products. Finally, here's the SWE products that use the EOF method and predicted principal components using our different variable data sets. And we see that the products resulting from PC estimates from ISAT2 strongly underestimated SWE at mid elevations, while the ones that used ERA 5 and a combination of the variables look actually pretty similar to our best case scenario for the EOF method. Overall, most products had much lower magnitude spatial errors than Snowdass. This was 2019. We can also look at another extreme year, 2015. Remember that that's a very low snow year. We can see that the products with the least amount of error are actually Snowdass and the EOF that used variables from both ERA 5 and ISAT2. So this makes me think that maybe observations are really important in this weird year, since Snowdass assimilates observations, and this EOF method used ISAT2 observations in addition to the ERA 5 meteorology. There's a common theme among most statistical techniques that underestimate low and mid elevations and overestimate the higher elevations. Maybe there's some latitude signal in there as well. Note that the EOF product that used ERA 5 and ISAT2 seems to have kind of muted the error signals from the EOF products that only use one of the variable sets. And then finally, in the average year, 2009, we see that the statistical products had overall much lower bias than Snowdass, and they had somewhat similar errors to each other based on elevation and latitude. Overall, magnitude of the errors seems to be lower for the EOF methods than the SA methods, with a few exceptions, like the underestimation in 2015 for the EOF that used the ISAT2 data. And also there was very low error for both standard anomaly products in 2009, which was more of an average year. So this was 3 years, but we did this for all of the years in the record. So let's look at metrics for all years. Now I'm showing box plots of each product, showing the R-squared value. We can see that all the statistical products had higher spatial correlation than Snowdass. If you squint, you can kind of see that the EOF products tended to have slightly higher R-squared than the SA products, but the difference is not very big. We can see that 2015 was a low outlier year for the statistical methods. We can also look at root mean squared error, which shows that all products, the statistical products, have lower root mean squared error than Snowdass, with one exception, which was Snowdass having very low RMSE in 2015 relative to the other products. And then we can also look at percent bias. So most of the statistical products had minimal median percent bias, although the SA method that used ISAT2 data was biased low, and Snowdass was overall biased a bit high. 2015, you'll notice, was a big outlier year for most statistical methods. They can't even be plotted on this plot. But the EOF method that used data from ISAT2 and ERA 5 and Snowdass actually had much less bias in this odd year. And this kind of confirms what we saw in the spatial maps that we looked at earlier. Overall, the simplest method that we used here uses standard anomalies from ERA 5 to calculate SWE, since ERA 5 is available globally with only a 5-day latency. And this gets you most of the way there in terms of identifying these spatial SWE. You gain some incremental improvements by using the EOF method to identify additional spatial patterns in the standard anomalies, especially in outlier years like 2015. We have slightly better, still an outlier, but it's slightly better than just using ERA 5. Or sorry, just using standard anomalies. The EOF method also gains some incremental benefits from addition of satellite observations in outlier years like 2015. So in conclusion, or in summary, I guess, in chapter 3, we refined the standard anomaly patterns by using an EOF analysis in addition. We found that including observations in the principal component regressions or in assimilation in our snow models was especially important in extreme years like 2015. We used current year data that is available globally, maybe theoretically, in the sense of ISAT2. And the statistical methods generally had more accurate spatial distribution than SNODAS did. And the methods used here could be potentially used globally because they don't rely on in situ stations. And it's likely that observations from satellite data or other targeted observations will be even more important in regions where ERA 5 is not as accurate. ERA 5 assimilates in situ and other data sources. So in data sparse regions, it has slightly less accuracy. And so constraining using observations might be more important in these regions. Okay, we made it to the dissertation summary. Good job, everyone. So overall, we found that historical snow patterns contain usable predictive structure. Simple standard anomaly methods can work well where stations exist. Sorry, I'm going to read off the slide, actually. My speaker notes don't line up. We found that ISAT2 enables large-scale snow depth representation of median snow depth at the mountain range scale. Our simple standard anomaly methods work pretty well, especially in cold regions and years with predictable patterns. The EOF analysis provided incremental refinement on the standard anomaly patterns and was especially important we think it's especially important in regions and years with complex patterns. Then within the EOF framework, we gain accuracy from including observations, especially in extreme years. And the frameworks tested here could be applied in data sparse mountain regions. For future work, studies could quantify improvements in hydrologic modeling from using these statistical SWE estimates. They could test the use of maybe additional modes of variability in the EOF analysis, since we only looked at the first 3. Could identify dominant modes of variability in other regions like the Andes or high mountain Asia. And then finally, really exciting, the Earth Dynamics Geodetic Explorer, or EDGE, has been approved by NASA as long as funding lines up. And so future work could simulate data from that satellite to see how it can be used in these methods to provide more observations. Okay, I'd like to thank my committee, especially my advisor, Jessica Lundquist. I feel really lucky to have gotten to work with you and learn from you these past 5.5 years through COVID lockdown, my master's, my PhD work. I have a lot of respect for you as a scientist and your ability to manage 5+ grad students, teaching your own research, being a mom to 2 kids, and more, I'm sure. And your enthusiasm for snow and climate science is infectious. Thank you also to my 2 other committee members, David Sheen, Bart Neeson, and to Lynn, my GSR. Here's some more fun pictures of each of them in the field. I've appreciated your guidance throughout co-authoring papers together and my journey as a grad student at UW. Thanks to my family and friends, Mom, Dad, Grandpa Mike. Thank you for your unwavering support throughout my life. Pat, thanks for your all that you do for following me to Norway last year, making waffles. Mountain Hydrology Research Group, you all are the best, and I couldn't do this without you. Some more photos, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. 10 minutes for questions, and I'll let you field your question.
Great. I was worried we would be late, not have too much time. I'm gonna go back to the fun friends photo instead of my thank you slide because it's more fun to look at all your lovely faces. If you're not on these slides, it's just because it's my own fault. I'm sure you should all be on these thank you slides. Okay, yes, any questions? Charlie.
You mentioned particularly early on that snow water equivalent was ways to estimate it were complicated by rain events during the winters, rain on snow kinds of events. So how does that filter through the conclusions of all the EOF mapping and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think so the standard anomaly method is going to capture kind of your average year patterns. And then when we run the EOF analysis, we're getting these other dominant modes of variability. And we saw that one of them was related to elevation. And so that pattern doesn't explain a ton of the variability in the input data, but it becomes more dominant in certain years. So it may be in years that you have warmer temperatures and you have kind of a different elevation pattern to the SWE distribution. That's a year when that spatial pattern would have a stronger temporal weight. So refinement of our understanding of these patterns using the EOF analysis, I think is what helps with that rain on snow and midwinter melt, which is going to impact, right, during a storm when you have rain at low elevations, it's going to maybe decrease your SWE amount a little bit, at least won't add to it. And at high elevations, maybe you're getting a lot more snow. And so your pattern is going to look different. And so hopefully the EOF method is going to address some of those issues. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, Dad.
So if I'm a water resource manager, someplace in California or even in Central Washington, and I'm trying to say, I need more accurate information to be able to predict for my water users summer, how much water is going to be available. How would I be able to use the information you've been able to analyze here in real time to get a better estimate? I mean, right now, they predict every month how much water is going to be available for senior water right users and junior water right users. That's not super accurate, so I hear what you're saying. How would they use this information to be able to get more accurate?
So the question was about how water managers would use these spatial SWE maps to improve the estimates of runoff so that they can allocate water to water users in the most efficient manner. And I want to highlight especially that if we're talking also about the Sierra Nevada, they can do a really good job. They have a lot of data. Water managers are really plugged into what's happening in the mountains there. They're using like snow course measurements. They go out every month and take cores of the snow and weigh it to figure out how much snow water equivalent they have. Again, those are just a transect. It's not the full spatial distribution of SWE. But especially, as we see changes happening where we have less snow in each year, each drop of water is worth a lot to agriculture, to our water systems. And so we really need to make these incremental improvements so that we can just do a little bit better at predicting water. So, but to answer your question more directly, a water manager would probably use a spatial distribution of SWE as input to a hydrologic model that can then be running simulations to see when they think the stream flow will enter the reservoirs and things like that. So it'd be an input to a hydrologic model. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, Eric.
Congratulations, that was fantastic. You've done such amazing work here. I'm kind of wondering about using this method in the future, and thinking about whether the standard anomaly approach, does that assume implicitly something about stationarity? And if so, does that do longer term signals pop out in the EOF analysis?
That's a good question. So using this historical information to identify these historical patterns does assume some stationarity. And we do know from published papers, I'm thinking Cowherd et al. 2024, that spatial distribution of SWE will likely change. It'll change, I think, different amounts in different mountain ranges based on their characteristics. And I think as we see these changes, it's important to keep updating our reanalysis historical information so that we can take that into account. It is a caveat of this work. So as patterns change at an increasing rate, we might reach a point where you can't really use historical information anymore, but I don't think we're at that point yet. And so I think we can still use these patterns, but it'd be nice. Like you see, we're still using data from 1990 to 2021. It's been 5 years. Maybe we should update our reanalysis products, which would be great because then we can use them more. So thanks for your question, Eric. Tabitha.
I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail on future work that you're excited on the edge product and what is going to change or what you expect will change with some of your work.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the question was about the Edge satellite that is accepted. Hopefully it will be launching 2030. Wow. Funding, as long as funding is approved. And actually, one of my committee members, David Sheen, is involved in the proposal and then will be involved in the science team that works on that satellite. And to my understanding, I'm not part of that team, so I only know what I've kind of read in little blurbs about it. And I'm sure they're still developing the ideas behind it, but potentially it will add, you saw with ISAT-2, we had 6 individual beams that are collecting elevation data, and EDGE would collect more distributed data. So it's going to add more altimetry measurements for the globe. And my thought is that potentially if there's more coverage, we would be able to use directly, potentially, EDGE elevation data that's in the snow off season, and then also in the snow on season, so that maybe it would reduce our reliance on these airborne LiDAR flights. Does that line up with what you think, David?
More beams.
More beams, yeah, more data. We love it. And also at some point, ISAT-2 will die. I mean, it's still going strong, so that's great. But these satellites don't last forever, so it'd be nice to have additional data into the future. Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. Andrew.
The major blocker you mentioned earlier for operationalizing this method is the data processing of the ISAT-2 data, right? So what would you need to happen to make this product more operational for the water resource planners in India?
Yeah, thank you. The question is about the data latency in the ISAT-2 product. So the current process that NASA goes through with this data is they release like a quick look product after 3 days, but there are larger geolocation errors. And geolocation is really important with this like high resolution elevation data, because especially if you have any sort of a slope, then any sort of horizontal offset is gonna look like a vertical offset. So what would be really great is then there's like additional data processing that goes into refining the geolocation of the data. And so, I don't work on this. Our thought is that if NASA prioritizes the data processing to refine that geolocation accuracy, if it is moved up in the priority at data centers, that it could be produced maybe on we would hope, maybe a 1-week timescale for water managers to use that data. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
That is the case. We're working.
Oh, great. Thank you, Tyler. Yay. Yeah, Nicoletta.
If you were to validate your product on this, you mentioned high mountain Asia or someone places, how would you approach this and what validation products is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is about if I were to evaluate these methods in somewhere outside of the Western US, what products would I use and how would I go about that? So I have thought about this a bit, and I think the next place that I would try to use this method is in the Andes. They have kind of a similar layout to the Sierra Nevada, right? It's still the American Cordillera, it's just in the Southern Hemisphere. So I think there are some similarities there that we could use to help guide our efforts. And the Western US SWE reanalysis product, or WUSR, the framework that was used to produce that product was also used to produce a reanalysis product in Andes, in the Andes that has been compared to the in situ stations that are available there. And so I think as a first pass, I would use the reanalysis data set in the Andes as the validation data and to provide the historical record, and then use ERA5 reanalysis meteorology to calculate standard anomalies, maybe do the EOF analysis as well. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so before we thank Hannah one more time, I'm just gonna say everyone needs to take their snacks and move out. Hannah, you can also just walk everyone out for a few minutes. The committee will meet briefly and then call you back in. You just don't get to leave the building.
Yep.
Everyone else. All right, let's give Hannah a big round of applause.